There is a story buried in the book of Exodus that most preachers skip entirely, not because it is boring, because it is deeply unsettling. Moses has just received one of the most dramatic callings in all of Scripture. God appeared to him in a burning bush, spoke his name, commissioned him to stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of an entire nation of slaves. Moses argued, God answered every objection, and Moses finally agreed to go. And then, on the way to Egypt, God tried to kill him. Exodus 4:24. Just like that. No warning, no explanation, no build-up. The text is brutal in its brevity. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. That is it, 4 verses. And then it is over. Scholars have called this one of the most enigmatic passages in the entire Old Testament. The Jewish sages wrestled with it for centuries, and most modern readers either skip past it, spiritualize it into something comfortable, or quietly assume there must be a typo. There is no typo. And the reason God moved against Moses that night reveals something about the nature of covenant that most of us have never fully grasped. Stay with me, because this passage will change how you read the entire story of Moses, and maybe your own. Let's start with what the text actually says, because the English translation flattens something the Hebrew makes visceral. The phrase sought to put him to death in Hebrew is vayevakesh hamito. The verb bakash means to seek, to pursue, to go after something with intention. This is not an accident. This is not a near miss. God deliberately moved against Moses at that campsite. And Moses did not stop it. His wife did. Zipporah, Moses' Midianite wife, acts with startling speed. She takes a flint knife, circumcises their son on the spot, touches Moses' feet with a foreskin, a phrase that carries its own interpretive debate, and declares, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." And God relented. Just like that it was. Over. Now here is the question that every serious reader has to sit with. What did Zipporah understand that Moses had apparently forgotten? To answer that, you have to go back to Genesis 17, the covenant of circumcision. When God established his covenant with Abraham, he gave him a sign to carry in his body. Not a symbol on a wall, not a mark on a doorpost, a physical, irreversible mark in the flesh of every male in Abraham's household. Genesis 17 is unambiguous about the stakes. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Cut off. That is the exact covenant language. The sign of belonging was circumcision, and its absence was covenant rupture. Moses' son was uncircumcised, the man God had appointed to liberate an entire nation, to confront the most powerful ruler on earth, to be the mediator of God's covenant with Israel. That man had not kept the most foundational sign of the covenant in his own household, and God was not going to let that contradiction stand. Here is what makes this passage so jarring to modern readers. We are uncomfortable with a God who takes covenant terms this seriously. We prefer the picture of God as patient, long-suffering, endlessly accommodating, and he is those things. But the God of the Bible is also a God who enters binding agreements, and he treats those agreements as real. Think about what a covenant actually was in the ancient Near East. It was not a contract in the modern legal sense. It was a relationship structure with its own internal logic, its own obligations on both sides, its own consequences for violation. When God made a covenant, he swore by himself because there was no higher authority to appeal to. And when his covenant partners failed to hold their end, the covenant itself demanded a response. Moses had been living outside the covenant sign. Whether that happened gradually, through neglect, or through compromise with his Midianite context, or through some domestic disagreement with Zipporah, we are not told. The text does not explain how it happened. It only shows us what it cost, and what it nearly cost was everything. I want to stop here for a moment and say something that might be uncomfortable. There is a version of Christian life that treats grace as a license to be casual with what God has called us to. Not rebellious exactly, just inattentive, slowly drifting from the thing we once held closely, allowing the pressures of circumstances, relationships, geography, or convenience to erode something that was never meant to be optional. Moses was not an evil man. He was a chosen man who had let something slip, and the night God came for him was not an act of cruelty. It was, in a strange way, an act of mercy. Because if Moses had walked into Egypt carrying that internal contradiction, carrying the call of God with one hand and covenant neglect with the other, he would not have lasted. The mission required a man whose private life matched his public commission. God was not trying to destroy Moses, he was trying to complete him. Now notice something remarkable about who actually saves Moses' life in this moment. Not Moses, Zipporah. This is a woman who is not an Israelite. She is a Midianite, the daughter of a priest of Midian. She had no covenant history with Abraham, no childhood formed by the stories of the patriarchs. And yet she is the one who immediately grasps what is happening next. How did she know what to do? The text does not say. But it implies that somewhere in their life together, Moses had told her about the covenant, about Abraham, about what circumcision meant. And when the moment came, she connected the dots faster than Moses apparently did. She picked up the flint knife. She did what needed to be done. And she saved the man God had chosen by performing the very act that sealed the covenant. Circumcision was Abraham's sign. Moses had neglected it. Zipporah restored it. And the word she spoke afterward, bridegroom of blood, is strange and raw and ancient. Scholars have debated its meaning for generations. But one reading is this: she is naming the covenant. Blood is the currency of covenant, the mark made in blood, the relationship sealed by it. She is saying, in effect, now you are truly bound, now the covenant holds. And God released his grip on Moses. There is a detail in this passage that is easy to miss, because the text moves so quickly past it. The passage says God sought to put him to death. Most translations assume the him is Moses. But a number of ancient Jewish interpreters, including Rashi, read the Hebrew differently. Some believed God was moving against the child, not Moses. That it was the uncircumcised son whose life was in danger, and that Zipporah's act transferred the covenant penalty through the circumcision itself. Either reading leads to the same conclusion. The covenant was in rupture. The rupture had to be addressed, and until it was, the mission could not proceed. Subscribe if this kind of deep textual work matters to you. This channel is built on going back to the original languages and asking the questions that comfortable readings tend to skip past. If you are new here, there is a lot more where this came from. Fast forward to the end of Moses' life, and this single campsite episode looks like the interpretive key to everything that follows. Moses goes into Egypt. He stands before Pharaoh 10 times. He leads 2 million people out of slavery. He mediates the law at Sinai. He carries a people through a wilderness for 40 years. And through all of it, one of the defining themes of his leadership is this: the details of the covenant matter. The form of obedience matters. God's instructions are not suggestions to be adapted to convenience. The man who almost died because his son was uncircumcised becomes the man who insists that Israel not cut corners with God. The lesson of the campsite shaped the prophet. And this is how scripture works. The moments that nearly break the main character are almost always the moments that prepare him for what is coming. So what does Exodus 4:24 mean for you? Not as a threat, as a question. Is there something God has clearly called you to that you have quietly allowed to slip? Not because you are rebellious, not because you stopped believing, but because life got complicated, or circumstances made it inconvenient, or you just kept meaning to get back to it. Moses was not in Midian instead of Egypt because he hated God. He was there because it was where he had ended up. And sometimes the things we let go of are the same way. Not abandoned in anger, just slowly left behind. The passage does not end with Moses destroyed. It ends with Moses continuing the journey. His wife acted, the covenant was restored, and the mission continued. God did not disqualify Moses. He confronted the thing that needed confronting, and then he let Moses go. That is the shape of this story: crisis, confrontation, correction, continuation. There is one more thing that deserves to be said about Zipporah. She is not a named hero in most Sunday school curricula. She does not have a book of the Bible. She is barely mentioned outside of a few passages. But on the night that the entire Exodus story nearly ended before it began, she was the one who held it together. God used an outsider to rescue an insider who had forgotten what he was carrying. That should make every one of us a little more humble about where wisdom and faithfulness show up, and a little more grateful for the people in our lives who see clearly when we cannot see ourselves. The God of Exodus 4 is not a God of paperwork. He is a God of covenant. And covenant is not a bureaucratic arrangement, it is a living relationship with weight on both sides. Moses carried the call, but he had to carry the sign too. The burning bush was spectacular. The campsite almost killed him. And it is entirely possible that the campsite made him ready for everything the bush demanded. God finishes what he starts, but sometimes, before he can finish, he has to come after the thing that is standing in the way, even if that thing is inside the man he called. If this passage opens something new for you, share it with someone who reads the Bible seriously. Leave a comment, I read them all. And may the God who confronted Moses and then sent him anyway, meet you with that same relentless covenant-keeping faithfulness wherever you are today.